In this episode of The Bear Roars, Dan chats with Ian Dickinson, President and CEO of Longpath Technologies, a climate technology company utilizing advanced laser-based sensors for real-time emissions monitoring. With over 2 decades of leadership experience, Ian excels in business strategy and team building, transforming Longpath from a startup to a successful enterprise. His leadership focuses on strategic direction, fostering innovation, and supporting sustainability goals in the energy sector. Dan and Ian discuss Longpath's methane sensing technology, Ian's experience in the fast-paced telecom industry, and the role Colorado plays in the quantum revolution. Let's poke the bear to kick off the conversation.
Well, Ian Dickinson, thank you for being part of this.
I'm thrilled to be here, Dan. Thanks for the invite.
Yeah, it's going to be a great story to tell, especially because we're on the cusp of a revolution that's going to be every bit as big as AI. It's not going to fully be here for a little while, a few more years, but you and your company are at the front end of it. So I'm looking forward to talking through that and see how you could take the newest kind of technologies, in this case quantum, and put them to commercial use even before the big commercialization of quantum gets underway. But before we go there, let's start with how we first met.
Yes.
So tell us the circumstances.
07.
Let's see, what else happened in 2007?
Zayo was launched.
Zayo was born.
Zayo was launched. I came in, I was trying to remember, Dan, I came in, I think 7 months in. You guys had done 7 acquisitions in the first 7 months. And I joined.
I'm not sure we did exactly 7 for 7 months, but it
was something like that.
Yeah, we were up and going. That's for certain. Certainly, we did. You
guys were on pace. But I think I got there. We got the Memphis deal done.
Yes.
And then we did the Minnesota deal.
Yes.
And I was running the CFO for the bandwidth business. We were above the library.
Yes.
In Old Town Louisville, right?
Yeah, that's right. Because we started in downtown Boulder on Pearl Street.
Okay.
But soon thereafter, we had to move because we had a really small building there. So we moved to downtown Louisville. And
that's when that's when I joined. We had 2 different spots, if I recall.
Yes.
Above the library and then just a block or 2 over. Mm-hmm. But so I was there for about a year, 9 months, and I got recruited away. I wonder sometimes whether that was I think about that because I'm here doing what I'm doing today, and I just couldn't be more thrilled. But it was an incredible year with you guys. I got recruited away to be the CFO for a really interesting E911 service provider. That was
Entrada?
Entrada was the group up at Longmont. So this was Vixie Solutions, and we were moving the E911 onto an IP platform off the Switch network. So anyway, it was a great experience. I met some great people, Sandy and Ken and that whole team, and I've stayed in touch with folks. So yeah, it was a great experience. And my background, it's interesting because what I'm doing now really isn't telecom, but there are some similarities. Yeah, our business model is very similar.
Yeah, because there's the infrastructure component.
Yep.
There's a networking component.
Yep.
That probably is going to come into play more and more as you go forward.
Yeah.
So let's skip forward, and then we'll come back as to how you got there. But let's skip forward and talk about who you're with today.
Yeah.
And what they do, where it came from, where it originated, the idea, the technical people, and how you ended up as CEO of the company.
Yeah. So Longpath has a great origin story, and I think it's a story that we need to see played out more often. Mm-hmm. And it's this idea of taking these really innovative technologies and moving them through this kind of process of spinning them out of the lab or out of the university and into a full commercial business. And people talk about this kind of valley of death. And so I'll describe a little bit about the history, but
and what is Valley of Death? So when people talk about Valley of Death, what are they referring to?
It's a term that people throw around, but it's this idea that some of these really advanced early stage technologies, it's hard for the private capital markets, based on their time frames of their funds and the risk profiles, to say, hey, I'm going to make a bet on something that's going to take another 10 years of development. And so Longpath is an example of having the advantage of some public-private partnership, right? So funding from the Department of Energy's ARPA-E program that allowed this technology to move from a lab table to something that was ready for commercial scale. And really at that time positioned to raise a typical venture round. And we did a seed round, but Greg Reeker, who is the lead co-founder, Colorado native, PhD from Stanford, had been entrepreneurial spirit, had been working on a tabletop particle accelerator concept in the Bay Area, decided that wasn't going to work and got really interested in these frequency comb lasers, which won the Nobel Prize in 2005 out of the University of Colorado. Jan Hall was a professor. NIST was doing a bunch of work with this technology, and Greg had
so that was one of 4
Nobel
Prizes
yes.
awarded in quantum to Boulder, combination of NIST and CU Boulder.
Yes.
4 of 8 Nobel Prizes of quantum
Amazing.
in the entire world.
It's
4
amazing.
that came right here in our backyard.
Right in our backyard, and these frequency comb lasers have a lot of physics applications, and beyond my pay grade to describe it, but the atomic clock, and then a lot of the quantum innovation is coming through innovations like the frequency comb.
Are you able to, in layperson's terms, describe what a frequency comb is?
Yeah, so I'm not technical, and
Right.
I'll describe a little bit more of my background and how I found my way to Longpath. But so the term comb comes from, think of a hair comb,
Yep.
right? So you've got these perfectly spaced beams, right?
Teeth,
And
teeth on combs and beams of light
correct.
for frequency combs.
Right, and so they can be very controlled in terms of the frequencies they're sending out. They can send out hundreds of thousands of frequencies or colors of light. And so that allows for levels of calibration and other, again, applications that get beyond my depth. But that's where the term comes from. So everybody's familiar with a laser pointer, right? You're sending out a single color of light. This is sending out, in some cases, hundreds of thousands or more colors of light.
And each color of light interacts with atomic particles
Correct.
in an extraordinarily unique way. So it could be a slightly different color or comb,
Yes.
slightly different color, and what that color is able to detect is different than what the color adjacent to it is able to detect. So by having
Yes.
a frequency of combs, and you said how many? Like hundreds?
Well, and some of these comb lasers, and they're sending out hundreds of thousands. It depends on the application. So to the point you're making, so for Longpath, what we're doing is open atmosphere sensing, right? And so we're interacting with them at the molecular kind of atomic level. And every molecule in the atmosphere absorbs light at a certain frequency. And so it's really for
at
us
a certain very precise
frequency. And there's absorption patterns, right? But there's certain frequencies where that molecule is at its max absorption. And so for Longpath, we're tuning the system to detect, in this case, methane, right, which is a huge absorber of near-infrared light, which makes it such a potent greenhouse gas. But as a general statement, it's just a matter of...
Before let's stay on that methane point for a second. So, and you touched on it, but maybe if you go a little deeper, and why is it important to detect methane? Like under what circumstances, is there methane that people want to detect, and why do they want to detect it?
Yeah, so methane, this has become more common knowledge, but for those who aren't familiar, methane is the most potent of the greenhouse gases. It's about 80 times more potent than the exhaust from your car. And so estimates accounts for about 30% of climate change, of global warming. And so it's the single biggest lever we have to pull in terms of climate action for emissions. And so methane ends up becoming kind of a really important target. Now, methane is, there's lots of sources of methane. There's natural sources of methane. And then there's human-created sources of methane, and primarily around agriculture, oil and gas, mining, landfills. And so the opportunity to address that issue, methane is again the biggest lever. Now, we're focused in oil and gas, and so that methane is actually the natural gas escaping from the pipe. So it's an acute issue. We can find the leak source, and it's a major cause. It's a major source. So our focus at Longpath is methane because it's a really potent greenhouse gas, and it's an addressable issue.
Why is it hard to find the leaks?
Methane is invisible, odorless, right? And so you can't see it, you can't smell it. You might be able to hear it if it's coming from a small aperture at high velocity, but it's otherwise invisible. And so you need technologies like Longpath to detect it, and then to be able to alert, in this case, the oil and gas operators of an emission event so that they can get out and address it. So what's interesting is, and this is just the case, generally speaking, with greenhouse gases, is that the sources of the greenhouse gases are greater than the sinks. So the trees are absorbing CO2, right? So you have these natural sinks of methane and other CO2. But right now we've got more sources coming into the atmosphere. And so there's a gap, we just talk about methane, between the sources and sinks. And so the goal is to close that gap. And that'll flatten the curve. And so the core purpose for Longpath in our vision statement is to flatten the methane curve. And we think we can do that. It's actually really encouraging. There'll be a paper coming out that Greg's been working on, and some of our other technical folks, that if you look at the emissions that we've reduced on the facilities we're monitoring today, and you extrapolate that out across all of oil and gas, I realize it's a big extrapolation, but that alone would close the gap. That alone. So agriculture, CCUS, all these other things are important, but just that in oil and gas would close the gap. So that's energizing, and that was the vision that Greg had initially when he got involved with this technology.
And when did he have this vision, roughly? What year would that be?
It's like 2012. You should have Greg on. He's phenomenal.
Oh, yeah.
He's a wonderful person and just brilliant. But so in 2012, he had a vision for doing spectroscopy with this technology, right? And that's that open atmosphere sensing. So moved from the Bay Area back to Boulder. He grew up in Lakewood and started working with these systems. And in 2015, the Department of Energy came out with this ARPA-E monitor program, which was to fund promising technologies to get after this emissions issue. And so Greg brought a founding team together of 3 other brilliant folks and formed the tech founding team in 2015 through this ARPA-E grant, and just started the hard work of taking what was, these laser systems, and you can still see some of these in the labs. They took up an entire lab table, probably 100 square feet, and started the work to refine that, and then shrink it down to something that was fieldable. You could put into the field. So that was about $10 million of grant funds that came into Longpath starting in 2015. They did a bunch of work, and there's some phenomenal stories along that path, right? Moments of, this just isn't going to work. Yeah. Right? There's a great story Greg tells of sitting on top of the roof at NIST, shooting a laser up to NCAR, right? Off of Giant Mere. Now we use
at NCAR is, so NIST is in the foothills of Boulder, pretty close to the university.
Yes.
And NCAR is about a handful of miles away?
Yeah, I would say 2-3 kilometers, a couple miles away, right? Up on a hill. And so
even higher up the hill in just the most scenic part of Boulder where you see the foothills. It just sits there perched up high.
Yeah.
So they're trying to connect these 2 locations.
Yeah, so he's sending the light out, and what we do is we send the light out and reflect the light back. And what we're looking for is the absorption features, right? So it's almost like the fingerprint of methane shows up in the light spectrum that's missing, right? So it absorbs that light, and so it doesn't return. And so you can get a very clear kind of fingerprint of how much methane. I'll describe that in a bit more detail, but Greg was sitting on the roof, and he tells the story, and he's just questioning everything about this decision to get
He's having a bad day.
Yeah, and he's just like, what did I put myself into? And this is because it's just not working, right? Yeah. And it's about 2 a.m, and all of a sudden, bing, bang, bang, he starts getting these signals that clearly CO2. So he's calling all his other colleagues up, at 2 a.m, and they come up to the rooftop and they have this celebration, this is working. And there were moments along this path from 2015 through 2020 where, like in any startup, right, in any kind of venture like this, where you think, well, this just might not work. And so some really very cool stories of kind of getting to that next step. And there might be some other stories we're telling on that front, but the way I got involved, it was late 2020. We're in the midst of COVID, and I was mountain biking with my brother-in-law and a couple of buddies in Fruita, which is western Colorado on the western slope, great mountain biking. And I get a call from Bob Gill. You know Bob Gill.
Do I know Bob Gill?
I think you know Bob Gill. Well, maybe you don't. But anyway, I had worked. I was a CFO for a company. This was Vixie Solutions that Bob was chairing back in 07, 08.
Okay.
And we had stayed in close contact, but in we lost contact some 2013, 2014. Hadn't talked to him for years. He calls me and he says, "Hey, I'm chairing this really interesting spin out from the University of Colorado. And they're at this stage now where they're needing to contemplate this inflection point from government grant funding to going out and raising private capital and building a real business out of it." And so I talked to him for about 15 minutes. He described these frequency cone lasers. And so anyway, I go back to the campfire now. I'm probably 2 beers in. I go back to the campfire. It's like 7 p.m. at night. And we sit back down. I said, very interesting call with Bob Gill, talking about these frequency comb lasers and detecting methane and other greenhouse gases. My brother-in-law is a physicist at NIST and works with the comb lasers on the atomic clock. So the whole night, he's giving me lessons on these frequency comb lasers. So anyway, I got back to Boulder and he introduced me to the founding team. We met outside because at that time you couldn't be indoors, and got to know them and just was struck by just the innovation, the grit, and I just think the opportunity. I said, this is really something that's going to have a big impact. And so what started out as just very kind of simple, getting business plan organized and thinking about going out and raising some seed capital, led us to an opportunity for another grant. So we applied for another ARPA-E grant for scaling up, which was really thoughtful by the DOE because most of that grant money is really just for the technology, and the scale-up grants allowed you to invest in more commercial, right? So adding some salespeople and doing that. So we had a $5 million scale-up grant, and we went out and raised $2 million of seed convertible notes and started building the business, opening the first office.
And that would have been what?
That would have been early 2021. So,
it's only just 3 years ago.
Oh, yeah.
This is just 3 years ago.
Very recent, yeah.
Yeah, so let's talk a little bit about what a deployment. So where are you right now? Where's the company right now? Does it have a product? Does it have a service? Is it collecting revenue?
Yeah, so we've got 50 employees. We're headquartered here in Boulder. We've got 25 oil and gas companies that we're working with today. And we're growing rapidly. We are now looking at international expansion. So we've got great prospects developing in the Middle East, Australia, Europe.
Oh, I have a great contact for you in Saudi Arabia.
Okay.
If that's on your list.
That would be great. Actually, I was just down there midsummer. Not the best time to go.
No.
It's about 120 degrees.
In fact, some might say the worst time to go.
We were in Dubai and Abu Dhabi.
And they don't sell suntan lotion anywhere in that country, by the way, so I hope you brought some with you.
Great experience. I'd never been to that part of the world. That's the other thing that's been really interesting for me on a personal level with Longpath is it's been such a eye-opening opportunity. And I've had chances to meet folks and travel to areas and get involved, whether it's on the political side, the regulatory side, the science side. So that's been fascinating. But yeah, we were in Dubai and Abu Dhabi and Dammam. And out of that, we've got really interesting prospects with Saudi Aramco, which is the world's largest oil and gas producer. And ADNOC, which is another national oil company.
And how important is it for them to detect methane?
It's important. I mean, there's obviously the climate piece of this, right? But one thing, that's true with oil and gas is it's actually the product. It's like spilled milk at a dairy. So the methane is the natural gas. And so there's a huge incentive to keep the product in the pipe. And so outside of, we can talk about what the regulatory drivers are. We can talk about, the good stewards of the environment, those drivers. But there is just a practical economic case,
driver,
right? Now, there are other applications where the methane is maybe a byproduct, right? But in this case, with oil and gas, it's the product. I mean, there's an estimation right now that about a $9 to $11 billion is lost to the atmosphere in the U.S. alone, right? So there's real dollars that are being lost. So that's true really for any producer. I think it depends on the the geography, but if you think about Saudi Aramco, they're exporting their product largely. And so there are rules and there are certifications and standards being set that you need to certify that what you're delivering has been responsibly sourced. So a big drive towards reconciliation of your methane intensity of your production. And so the entire economy, I guess, energy economy is tuned into that dynamic. In the U.S. it's a little different. We have a regulatory regime that's kind of in a constant state of flux. There's some interesting dynamics that we expect to see in the new administration. But generally speaking, the primary drivers for our customers to address this issue really come from public sentiment. And those show up in demands from the capital market saying, hey, if we're going to invest in your company, we want to know that this product's being responsibly sourced. And then the end markets, right? So they've got to sell their product, and you've got folks saying, hey, I want to know that the gas coming to my burner top has been responsibly sourced. So those are big drivers. And then there's regulatory frameworks at the federal and state level. So it's a fairly complex demand environment.
Yeah.
But in some ways, what we do is quite simple. We provide a quantified emission flow rate and alert operators to fugitive emission events or just abnormal emission events. And in doing that, we're having a huge impact. I mean, already this year, just a fresh number because it was this morning, but we've mitigated about 4.2 billion cubic feet of methane, just small Longpath, right? 50 employees, we've got a lot of systems out. But, and to give you a sense for what that means, that's about 500,000 cars off the road for a year. Mm. It's about 30% of one day's LNG exports. It's about $11.5 million of product. And we charged about a third of that, right? So it's a huge return for the
Okay, so let's get back to, you got 50 employees.
Yep.
You have it out there working in the field. So describe what a field deployment looks like.
Yeah, so good context. So we put the sensor out on a 50-foot tower, right?
And the sensor looks roughly like
it's
what?
about the size of maybe 2 shoe boxes, right?
Okay.
And it's a telescope transceiver, so it's sending out the laser light, and then that laser light's being reflected back. So you set it on
what reflects it back? The atmosphere?
We have mirrors. Oh, okay. They're called corner cube mirrors, but it's just a very simple mirror, no power, no.
Where are the mirrors deployed relative to the 50-foot tower?
So what we'll set the central tower in the field, and then we'll set the mirrors at all the facilities within that tower's purview. So right now we're covering with each tower about 20 square kilometers, all right, 2.5 kilometer radius. And so all of the oil and gas facilities within that purview, we just place the mirrors out, and effectively what we're doing is we're bracketing each facility with a mirror. And what we create then is a laser fence line on the upwind and downwind side. And what we're looking for is a differential between those beams. So all the facilities that are in that 20 square kilometer area, we just set up mirrors very simply.
So it's this one box is shooting out lasers all directions, or at least everywhere there's a mirror.
Yeah, so you can think of it almost like a methane radar. It's not radar, it's obviously laser tech, but it's basically sweeping that whole area looking for emission events. And it's incredibly sensitive. Now, we don't detect to this level, but in layman's terms, we can see a quarter of a human breath change in methane. There's methane in the air all the time, but I'm talking about a change in methane from 2.5 kilometers away. Most of the IP, there's a lot of IP obviously in the hard tech, but a lot of the IP is in the inversion algorithms that take these concentration readings and all the other atmospherics, the plume modeling and the humidity, all these other atmospherics, and generates a quantified emission flow rate. So there's technologies that can detect a concentration of a greenhouse gas like methane. It's a whole nother thing to calculate an emission flow rate. And that's really valuable, and we can talk about why that's important. But in order for the oil and gas operators to optimize their leak detection repair work, it helps for them to know the size of the leak and for their own accounting. But that's basically how we set up. So the idea is that we're going to build, and we are in the process of doing this, build out a mesh network of towers. And this is where the similarity with the telecom model.
Yeah, before we get to the mesh network, so let's talk about, so you're beaming this light, it hits a mirror, and the mirror again is located
at the facilities.
at the facilities.
Yep.
When you detect back, you're able to tell if there's
Exactly.
concentration of methane
Exactly.
leakage. What do you then know about where the methane leak is coming from?
It's a great question. So let's just take an example of a facility, right? And so we're going to place, we got the tower 2.5 kilometers away. We're going to place 2 mirrors, one on each side of the facility on the back end. We're going to create that laser fence line. What we're trying to detect is there an emission event happening on this facility? Now we can put more mirrors out and do what we call sub-pad localization, where we can start separating equipment groups and saying, okay, this leak is coming from the tank battery or is coming from the compressor, whatever that equipment is. What's important for the oil and gas operators to know that that facility is having an issue. And then they'll dispatch somebody to do that final leak locate and then remediate it, right? Mm-hmm. And it depends on what the issue is. Sometimes just kicking a valve shut or closing a thief hatch on a tank. So that's our primary focus, is to say this facility is having an issue of this magnitude. What we see in the field is that every facility's got a baseline of emissions. And so we take some time to really establish those baselines, and then we're looking for anomalies. And we're looking for, and the customer can kind of set the alert thresholds, but we're looking for emission events that are above some statistical average to then kind of dispatch and go address the leak. So anyway, so as we put more towers out, we get greater and greater coverage. But what we don't do is we don't say, hey, it's this valve or it's this thief hatch. We say it's this equipment.
It's this facility. It's this location. You have a leak. Go figure out where.
Well, the other thing is interesting that's happening, and we play an important role in this, is that there's so much other data being collected on these facilities through their SCADA and telematics, that there's a lot of predictive analytics and correlations that we can draw. And so you might see a line pressure build followed by an emission. And so we're getting smarter and smarter every day about the predictive, right? This facility's looks like it's having an issue or is going to have a larger issue, or we see this emission event, it is highly likely it's coming from the tanks based on this other data. So there's some really interesting work going into, there'll be some AI and some machine learning to take these broader data sets and get even smarter about finding and fixing these leaks.
Okay. So then you start to talk about how these clusters then get internetworked?
Yeah. So you picture, again, a tower covering 20 square kilometers. And as we kind of place more towers out, we kind of create this network of coverage. It's usually the case when we put a tower out that we'll see more than one customer's facilities, right? Because they're all kind of intermeshed. And so we have towers that are monitoring multiple operators. And so as we build this network out, we just provide this kind of this coverage. And we were playing around with this, but I mean, to cover the entire Permian Basin, which is the largest producing basin, that's Texas into New Mexico, it would be less than the cost of the last James Bond movie to cover all of that. And part of the way that we're doing that is we just closed, it was 4 weeks ago now, a large loan commitment from the Department of Energy's Loan Program Office. That's a $162 million project capital line that we'll use to build this network out, along with equity that will match. But so the idea is just to kind of build out this coverage.
But what's the equity that will match? What does that mean?
Yeah, so just backing up a little bit, we raised that seed round in early 2021.
Before I knew you were doing this, or I would have been part of that.
Yeah, I know. There's another story on that front, but yeah, I would love to have you in that first go, because
it's not too late, by the way.
It's not. No, and I'll tell you where we are. But I did learn some lessons. I mean, I've learned a lot of lessons. This is by far the earliest stage company I'd ever been involved.
Yep.
And no office, right? There was just the
especially
four founders.
2021. I mean.
Yeah. And so we raised some seed capital and I learned some lessons there. It's very important to have folks that understand what a startup is. Right, and understand.
Well, that's always a difficult one when stuff's coming out of these universities and research labs. I mean, everyone thinks they can be an entrepreneur.
Yeah.
Everyone thinks they can be a business person, and sometimes you do find the unique kind of scientist who's also a very solid business person. I think Scott Davis at Vescent is an example of that.
Scott's brilliant.
But quite often there is, that is a hurdle that needs to be overcome. How do you truly become an entrepreneur, truly develop business acumen when you spent your entire 20-year career as a scientist?
Yeah, and it was an interesting thing about the founding team and talking with Greg very early on is he said, look, I'm very good at what I do. He has great business acumen, actually. But he said, I want this company to be successful, and I think the skill set I bring would be very helpful to that mission. And so very early on, normally you're bringing in professional management. A little later, maybe a Series A stage or something along those lines. But just in terms of bringing the seed investors that you bring in, it's worth really spending the time understanding their background and what they understand about startups and their tolerance for some of the dynamics. Because it's not a straight, even road.
No.
Right? I mean, there's these moments of shit. Can I say shit?
You can say what you want.
Where are we going from here? So learned some really important lessons at that early stage. We raised a Series A, $30 million.
I made Scott Davis did one of these. I just mentioned Scott, and Scott likes to throw out F-bombs here and there. And so I made him right away.
Okay. So shit's not bad. All right. I'll hold the F-bombs. But anyway, so we raised a Series A at the end of 2022. It's a $30 million Series A. And that got us really kind of to start growing. So where we sit today.
And who were your Series A backers?
Yeah, so we had a lead financial investor, White Deer Energy, based in Houston. And then out of that 30 million, they came in for 10. And then we brought in, very, very intentionally, we brought in some targeted strategics. So we brought in ConocoPhillips, the largest upstream. That means pulling, the oil and gas out of the ground. ConocoPhillips, Williams Corporation, which is a company which is the largest midstream operator. And we brought in another group called ProFrac, which is kind of doing a lot of the completions work. So that's how we rounded out the 30 million from a lead financial. And then the Buff Gold Fund is invested as well, which is great. Sally Hatcher in that group. But yes, we brought in the strategics, and then we've just been focused on growing the business, really with a domestic focus. This recent loan program office commitment puts us in a position now where we'll be approaching the market for a Series B. And what's interesting is when we made the announcement for the LPO, all of a sudden we started getting a lot of inbound interest. And so, we're infrastructure at the end of the day, back to kind of the telecom comparison. So we're building long-term infrastructure. I mean, these systems will have a 20-year life with just basic maintenance. So the idea is to build these networks out. And so, the capital partners that we're talking with today are really aligned around that vision of not just oil and gas. I mean, this LPO's got a broader mandate than that. So any application, landfills, mining, wastewater. And so we'll start pursuing what we term now as our non-core verticals, but we'll start expanding into those other areas.
Because the detection that you could do, I mean, you're focused on methane, and you talk about there's other areas to detect methane, but there's also other things you can detect.
Yes, I mean,
a lot of other things you can detect.
I mean, one of the things that's underway right now, and this is one of the very cool things about Longpath, and I give a ton of credit to the University of Colorado. What an incredible partner, and NIST, and others. But we've got this really great collaborative partnership with CU. Greg is our full-time CTO, but he's also a full-time professor at the university and runs the lab called the Reeker Lab. The work that they're doing in the lab is on the next generation. And so there's a large grant that came in. Longpath is a part of it. We're the commercial outlet for this. But Greg is leading a team from Caltech and UCSB and CU with a grant from the Defense Department, National Security, to start detecting aerosols. And what they're after is to start seeing the elements of bomb making, illicit drugs, disease in the air. And so that's an innovation that's coming.
So let's talk about illicit drugs. Maybe we'll use since it's all over the news all the time, the border between Mexico and the U.S. Where drugs come across that border. How could you envision a technology, Longpath developing a capability to detect drugs coming across the border.
Yeah, I mean, I think there'll be a lot of interesting applications. I think we'll go discover that, right? I mean, certainly you could look at setting up systems to monitor a border crossing, to look for things like illicit drugs. You could imagine a system monitoring a harbor and just kind of watching what's coming in and out and looking for fingerprints or detection of whatever you're targeting. There is some part of the innovation that's happening at the lab right now is to try to take these dual combs down to a chip. And so with that, we drive a lot of cost out. We can make it handheld. So it'll be interesting to see how the applications kind of meet the commercial need. One of the things that was fascinating for me is I think anytime you have a tech like this, and I'm sure there's lots of examples, but you have some vision for how you think it's going to be consumed by the market. Once you make contact with the market, sometimes everything changes. Mm-hmm. So initially, we were looking at it and saying, well, at the time, we're at 5 kilometers of radius. I just told you we're at 2.5, right? We were thinking, let's go to 8 kilometers of radius. Now we can cover a much bigger area. What we found is we actually had to shrink the radius because there was so much activity within that geography that it was just too much, right? So the tower has a certain bandwidth, number of readings it will make in a day. So I use that as an example of we thought, okay, then the first innovation is to get more distance. We made contact with the market, and it was actually we need to kind of shrink the radius. So we'll see kind of what develops out. It's a 3-year program, so it's going to take some time to really start testing the commercial side of it, but it's hugely promising.
What about, obviously Kennedy Jr. just getting named as the
Human health,
and a lot of what he talks about is agriculture and agriculture with fertilizers and other things we're doing, making the food unhealthy. I'm probably catching a little off guard here, but any thoughts on how there may be things to detect relative to agriculture?
On the ag side, yeah. So you can kind of, maybe oversimplifying, and we haven't spent a ton of time really pursuing this market, but agriculture includes livestock, right? Mm-hmm. And so cows and pig farming, they're a major source of methane and other greenhouse gases. But so the idea of monitoring, a feedlot, right? You could certainly do that and get a good sense for what the methane footprint is. The mitigation side's really the challenge, right? So there's a lot of work going into manure management, feed management. They talk about cow farts. It's actually cow burps. That's where most of the methane's coming from. And so
I don't know. Elon Musk says that's nothing to worry about. We don't need to worry about
apparently
that kind of methane. I don't know why he says that, but
I don't know. He said something different a few years ago, so I'm a bit confused by that. This is hard science. There's no question the impact it's having. But so it's interesting with if you there's an example of livestock. It's like, well, you could go shoot the cow, that would fix the methane. But
maybe what he's saying is if it was just methane coming from livestock, as you were saying earlier, nature can absorb that. It's the methane we're producing.
It's kind of the accumulation of all of these sources. But I'll just point you back to the point I made earlier, which is just in oil and gas, if we were to kind of drive the reductions that we've already driven across what we're monitoring, that alone would close the gap. NO2, which is really what gets emitted in the fertilizing process, people are looking at ways to do that more effectively. They found that if you let cattle free range, right, they actually create a sink by walking around on the ground. And so there's ways to kind of manage, your methane footprint depending on what application you're in or what business you're in. Little bit less direct impact. I mean, we see that as a very important component of what we're going to do in the future. But we got our hands full on the oil and gas front,
sure,
and a huge way to go. But part of what we'll do with the funding
detecting, can frequency combs be applied to detect rare earth minerals deposits, deep in the ground, or is that not something people talk about?
Not underground. Yeah, we're going to get outside of my depth here pretty quick, but
what
we're looking for, actually, I can say this. I mean, it's what's in the open atmosphere.
Okay,
right? So ground penetration is not kind of
that's a different application of quantum.
But it's amazing. Like Greg's lab also tunes the James Webb Telescope that's looking for Earth-like planets orbiting distant suns, right? So when those planets orbit in front of their sun, the light comes through that atmosphere, and the same principles. And what we're looking for is methane, H2S, signs of of life on distant planets. So there's all kinds of just interesting applications.
And do you guys work with Vescent at all? Because Vescent produces the frequency combs.
They do. We've built our own, and we've certainly procured a lot of components from Vescent. One of the big innovations that we've made in the last year and a half is we took on an effort to really reduce the power draw so that we could put the system on solar. Now, solar for good reason. It's great to have solar, but what it gives us is flexibility to put the tower wherever we need.
Gotcha.
We're out in these really remote areas. And so requiring line power is a
big cost.
Is a friction. Yeah, and it's a big cost. So we've made some refinements to what we're doing with the laser. That's a very important piece of our IP. And this is like ongoing innovation to really draw down the power. And so that we're not procuring equipment from Vescent at the moment, and great relationship with those guys. This quantum community is a small community.
Yes,
it's a phenomenal group of people. I mean, that's been one of the most rewarding things for me, having been involved with Longpath the last 3.5 years, is the people I've met and the other technologies that are just doing incredible stuff. And so they're a great company.
But very few of the other companies, there are others, but very few quantum companies have found the commercial use case that's already beginning to scale like you have. There are, Vescent and Maybell are examples of companies who are building kind of infrastructure for other quantum companies. Yep. So they've been able to find near-term product market fit as well. But it's a little bit different because who they're selling to is largely still working on the commercial product, that has yet to be fully commercialized.
We're doing the research.
Yeah, so they're more, at this point, more the development of the end product hasn't yet fully played out, but they need components in the meantime. Whereas in your case, you are deploying a real service.
Yeah, I mean, it's a real business. And, it's a little bit the nature of, on the quantum sensing side, there just was a clear practical application. Now, it's taken a ton of work to get there.
Yeah. Actually, let me pause you there for a second, because a lot of people who listen to this are people who are trying to learn more about quantum. And when people talk about quantum, the word that usually follows it is computing. Quantum computing, as if quantum computing is the only application of quantum. And this is one of many, many, many examples of a different category of quantum that is quantum sensing.
Yeah.
So quantum sensing means using quantum technology to sense things that are, otherwise very difficult to detect.
Yes.
If you don't have quantum capability available to you. In your case, you're applying it to methane and other things to detect, but for timekeeping, sensing becomes really important. For motion, it becomes very important for seeing into, as you said, your atmosphere, but seeing into
the Earth,
into the Earth and into the moon. Other types of quantum sensing applications will apply. So quantum sensing, we often talk about is, will beat quantum computing to commercialization.
Right.
But it also is a very large market.
Huge.
Yep. And then the third category of quantum is quantum networking or quantum communications. And the way I'd like to think of quantum network communications is when you start putting quantum devices out there like you guys are doing, well, those quantum devices are going to want to start to talk to one another, whether they're a quantum computer that has lots of different nodes and needs to talk to other quantum computers, or they're quantum sensors that need to connect to quantum computers or to one another. Those devices initially will be connected with today's internet. But if you look forward in time, they're going to want to be connected with more of a native quantum technology.
I was curious to get your perspective on that. So that's the case. Initially, it'll be going through the fiber network and connecting that way.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Still will go through fiber, but what will go through fiber won't be ones and zeros. It won't be
Gotcha. Yep.
pulses of light turning on and off. It'll be a quantum. The way I liken it is when we first came out with this thing called the internet, what did we do with the internet? Well, we converted into dial-up phone signals, and we converted into traditional SONET bandwidth networks, and we use DS1s and DS3s. We used technology that was designed for voice, and we applied it to the internet. But as the internet picked up steam, we started looking ways for internet devices that talk more efficiently, and with that became Ethernet and wavelengths as a mechanism for connecting internet nodes directly together with avoiding all those higher layer.
Yeah, because I wanted to ask you, so that
technologies.
you see a similar kind of direction for the quantum side, where it'll be the quantum systems communicating with each other.
Yeah, no doubt. And part of that will be driven by the advantages that quantum have in terms of encryption.
Okay.
So quantum communication, quantum networking is first thought of as a way to counter the effects of quantum computing, which could break encryption codes, to building a perfect encryption that cannot be hacked because it's in this quantum realm that is unhackable. But that is to solve a specific use case. That's to solve security.
Right.
But the bigger use case is when you start taking quantum computers and distributing them, they need to be connected together. And the first area you're going to distribute them is within the four walls of a data center. It's not going to be one quantum computer. It's going to be lots of quantum computers, and that's going to be easier to connect them together.
It's fascinating.
With that remaining in the quantum realm. But then you're going to start saying, well, they need to talk to quantum computers that are elsewhere. And you're going to start to say, okay, can we just connect fiber between those two locations and have the communication mode be quantum? So it'll just extend
rather
out.
than ones and zeros.
Exactly, is exactly. Ethernet first was a technology for when you were in a local area network, when you're in one location. But then it became a technology that you connected across wide area networks.
So it's the same substrate, so to speak, but it's now communicating in quantum.
Yeah, and it may even result in new types of fiber that are optimized for quantum. Now, quantum network and quantum communications is the third leg of the stool, and in my mind, the one that will be slowest to develop. It'll be invested in early because of encryption, but the need for quantum networking will exist only when lots of companies like Longpath already exist and already are putting quantum devices out there and are getting the connectivity between them. Like, why do we keep connecting these with traditional internet links? Maybe we should start connecting them with something different, and that's probably a decade from now before that starts to pick up momentum.
Yeah, it's interesting. We at Longpath we recognize we play an important role in that. Just by circumstance, the nature of our quantum application has a direct addressable market that we're in now. And so showing that that these technologies can go from the lab to commercial. So it's been fantastic participating with Elevate Quantum and the other innovators in this space. Again, what we're doing is different. But just having these proof points on the ground of these technologies become real world value add systems we talk about it as a company. It's like we need to be successful for lots of good reasons, right? For the climate, right? For our investors, but also for this broader ecosystem of quantum that's developing.
Yeah, and let's talk more about that. And let's start with, you mentioned Elevate Quantum. So what is Elevate Quantum, and why is it here in Colorado?
Well, Colorado has been for a long time, we talk about all the Nobel Prizes, a hub for some of the most astonishing innovations and really in quantum. And so it makes sense to put the energy and effort of all the disparate efforts that are going on and put that together. And, we played a small role in advocating on behalf of the quantum industry, but also Colorado, to say, hey, this is the place, right, where you can really build momentum. And we've got these incredible universities, and we've got an incredible entrepreneurial environment. We've got great capital providers. This is where you can create that win-win-win through that public-private partnership. And so that was just an organizing force, and just astonishingly successful to take people that are busy with what they're doing just in their day-to-day and come together and say, hey, this is part of a much bigger opportunity for us, as an industry, but as a state.
Yeah. And there are, as you mentioned, and you guys are a prime example, there are multiple real-world quantum companies that exist here in Colorado that are producing product, that have raised capital, that are scaling up, even one that is reportedly worth about $5 billion on paper, spin out of Honeywell, but multiple other ones. So Elevate Quantum is a nonprofit that is mission is to establish Colorado as a place-based ecosystem to accelerate the commercialization of quantum technologies. And as part of the effort that you were part of, I was part of, a lot of other people were part of, we were able to get awarded a significant amount of federal money and state money, $130 million so far, to build out kind of an ecosystem. And that includes a 72-acre site in nearby here in Arvada, a site here in Boulder. And those will be used to kind of bring entrepreneurs together, researchers together, and develop and commercialize companies to create jobs, sustain jobs, and importantly, keep us as a country, keep us at the forefront of quantum. So what I want to ask you is, why does it matter to be at the forefront of quantum?
Yeah, I think there's lots of good reasons. This is an incredibly competitive planet. I think for the U.S. to sustain its security, its ability to grow the next generation of economy, we've got to be on the cutting edge of this stuff. And I think we're so well positioned, if we do this right, to continue to lead on that front. But it's competitive. And, I'm actually heartened by the fact to see, and you had a huge part to play in this, Dan. You were a big organizing force behind Elevate Quantum. It takes that kind of grassroots, I guess I could call it that way, kind of bringing all the best and brightest together and leveraging the different capital sources, to create that collaboration. I think that's our competitive advantage, and it's critical. You talk about the AI revolution. There's a bunch of, things to worry about on that front. But I think if we can really be on the cutting edge and maintain a leadership position in quantum, that's going to be, some people would argue that's more important than even the AI side. So, I think at least for the part that we play, we've got a kind of a targeted set of things we're doing, but we see ourselves as really wanting to be part of ensuring that the U.S. stays in front of that innovation curve. I think it's really important.
The internet was born out of fear. When the old Soviet Union put Sputnik up in the air during the Cold War, it created a bit of a terror wave in the U.S. And the challenge that the government had was, how do we conceive of and build out a communication network that will work if there's nuclear war? A traditional phone network isn't designed to work because you cut lines and you're done. So the idea of needing a packet network came out of that, and they began to fund it out of fear. And from that came ARPANET. From ARPANET came the internet. And unbeknownst to the people working on it at the time, what they were also working on was something that was going to change the lives and livelihood of all humankind and create kind of an economic boom.
All these unintended consequences, right?
And the economic boom was of a proportion never seen before. We're still living off of the internet, boom. And likewise, quantum has a very similar dynamic. Quantum is an arms race, not a bit of it is an arms race. One that China is all in on, Russia's all in. Europe is investing a ton. Australia is investing a ton.
Right.
Other parts of Asia are significantly involved with it. So quantum is a race, and the race is both one of security because of how quantum can give advantages to nations relative to nations they don't like as much. But it also, like the internet, is certainly going to spark an economic boom that will last for 50 years.
In ways that we can't even imagine today, right? I mean, I think we can think about some of the more obvious promise, right? So quantum computing and the quantum communications, but all the other things that can spur out of that. To your point around the internet, I think, who knows? I mean, it's incredibly exciting to think about, but there's going to be things we just can't imagine today that are going to benefit from this evolution. Yeah. But it does say, it's interesting, it starts around a security framework, right? And then from there, it'll probably add all kinds of benefits. I mean, I'm, and you may know more about this, but the notion of an atomic GPS, right, where you don't need that connectivity to the satellite, right? Well, that creates all kinds of interesting potential for self-driving cars. That level of timekeeping and coordination, could have impacts that we can hardly imagine right now. I hope I'm around long enough to see it.
I suspect you will be for that kind of stuff. Yeah. Lost my train of thought. The AI is obviously a big deal and will remain a big deal for as long as we live and well beyond. Quantum's going to bring a different layer of how to build both software and devices and hardware that will complement what AI can do. AI takes a whole bunch of information, is able to make sense of the information, not unlike we do when we're using the internet and researching and using that to write new sentences or kind of craft new ways of assembling the words to mean something.
It's still framed on the ones and zeros.
It's still framed on ones and zeros, and it's still framed on information that largely already exists. Whereas the quantum realm is going to be totally different than that. And when those start feeding off of each other, that's when it's impossible to even envision at a high level what's going to come out of that. It's going to come out of that as something that is as different to our lives today as our lives are now relative to what they were like before the internet came out.
Yeah.
I mean, and who could have looked forward when the internet was first being played around with and say, hey guys, look, 30 years from now, you're going to be doing this kind of stuff. They've been like, they couldn't even have articulated, they wouldn't have even had the language to describe the stuff that we do today. It would have just sounded like, science fiction, garble.
Well, there's so many, and I think I've got, 3 children, one just graduated from college and one that's in high school. But I think about the opportunities for the next generation, and getting them familiar with the promise of some of these technologies so that they're coming into university or, preparing for that they're aware of and thinking about, this whole next kind of path for innovation. I mean, I think it's going to be really interesting to see kind of what these bright minds bring to this opportunity in the years ahead.
Yeah, I mean, to bring, just for people listening, quantum teleportation. You're talking about what quantum teleportation is. So, it's the word teleportation implies.
We're going to Star Trek.
Yeah. Teleportation implies you could take a physical object, have it disappear from one location, and the perfect replacement for it, replica of it,
instantaneously.
appears almost instantaneously at the speed of light. So you still have to have a signal transfer from one side to the other. So you're constrained by the speed of light, but constrained by the speed of light, you can move something from one spot to another spot, and the distance they are apart doesn't matter. They could be on one side of the Earth to the other. They could be between the moon and Earth. And so you say, okay, well, that sounds interesting. What will that create in terms of business opportunity? Now, teleporting stuff at scale is a long ways away. Teleporting stuff at atomic level already happens. So this isn't, gee whiz, maybe someday we could do this. We do it. It happens. It just happens.
And then it's building on
small.
that construct.
Yeah, so over time, it's going to get bigger and bigger. In fact, all of quantum communication, quantum networking requires teleportation.
That replication of the data packet.
Exactly.
In effect, right?
Exactly, where it's done through this true, not traveling through some kind of medium. It literally, some information, partial
that
information
entanglement
travels.
principle?
Yeah, it's the entanglement principle that is at play there.
Yeah, so we move packets of data through the ones and zeros across the fiber lines, and this is really that information being.
And it's not the information being reassembled. It's not that you're giving a bunch of ones and zeros from one spot to another and then using the ones and zeros to rebuild it. It truly is entanglement where these two entangled sets of particles, one exists on one side, their matching pairs exist on the other side, and you're basically igniting this side to completely disappear forever, and it reassemble itself on the other side, happening, only constrained by the speed of light. And, that's just an example when you try to say, okay, well, if you could do that, what would be the commercialization of that? And what would we think of it? I'm looking over your shoulder at some tequila bottles, Código, like, we could ship that Código bottle from here to there. It's like, okay, that might sound revolutionary as we sit here today, but what will people really be using when they have the capabilities? Will that be how you colonize a new planet? Will that be how you take rare minerals that exist on the moon, but would be very helpful if they exist here on Earth to get them from there to here at the speed of light, just because a relatively small amount of material of that type has huge commercial application here on Earth, but you got to get it from here to there. Maybe instead of using rockets to ship it over, you use quantum.
Because it's all particles at the end of the day.
Yeah.
Right? It's all, and so you should be able, if you have the resident material there, be able to replicate.
Yep.
I knew I was going to enjoy this conversation with you, Dan, just because I always enjoy our time together. But I was not aware of that. That's fascinating.
Yeah, but that's just kind of a random example. May or may not be one that the scientists would say, "Well, Dan, you're missing a couple of facts here of physics." But this one, I don't think they would. I would think this one. Well, we all know entanglement's real, and we know the principle. We're already using entanglement as the advanced humans have already learned how to leverage it, do it in ways that produce commercial value. It's how to do it at a bigger scale. It's a scaling, not a physics question. It's an engineering question at this point. And what will we be doing as we begin to perfect that? Who knows? That's where when we say quantum is going to change everything, that's what we mean by that.
Yeah. It's an amazing frontier. It's great to be on
So let's get back to Longpath. So Longpath, you mentioned you just received is a loan facility. I know you announced it from the government that's going to allow you to do what? What are you going to do with that money? Is that to deploy across the Permian Basin?
Yeah, so it's a project capital line, right? And so we can draw on it to deploy.
Is it a debt facility?
It's a debt facility, so we'll pay it back, incredibly advantaged terms, right? There's no way a company our size at our stage could get access to debt markets in that way.
And it's very low interest rate.
Very low interest rate, and very flexible terms. I mean, to get into too much details, but the way it's structured is that we've got a lot of flexibility. It's a 5-year program. We've got a lot of flexibility in the first 2 years under a fixed leverage kind of framework, right? So we just match in this framework 20 cents on the dollar, right? So we need to draw $1 to put the system out. We match 20 cents. And then it'll move into more of a variable leverage period in the last 3 years, but it's a 4-year AM on the first 2 year tranches and a 3-year AM. So it's really 8 years. And it's going to allow us, the capital we need to put this infrastructure out in a very efficient way. And there's really, not much more complication to it. It took 2.5 years. I mean, a lot of the LPO funds are going to, $1 billion to Ford for a battery factory, we're a small company, and I give a lot of credit to Jigger Shaw, who runs the LPO. I've gotten to know quite well, for bringing some real smart commercial thinking to the LPO and allowing companies like Longpath, who are quite small, to navigate that. And so we learned a ton, and it was a massive accomplishment just to get through the process. So it took 2.5 years. It was a ton of work, but it puts us in a position now where we really are capitalized in a way that we can go execute on this vision. And it is just domestic, right? And so we'll have to raise other capital for our international expansion. But what we've not found at this point is challenges attracting the capital. And that's very encouraging.
You mentioned earlier that with the announcement of this facility, there's been a lot of inbound interest. Can you share with us, not names, but can you share with us, is this, West Coast venture type money? Is it large infrastructure funds? Is it strategics? How are each of those categories showing interest in Longpath?
It's really in all of the above. And it was actually true in our Series A, all the way from kind of venture to strategic to infrastructure. And so we've got an interesting cross-section of inbound. There are, I don't know if I would say it's West Coast, East Coast. I think it's folks that are focused in climate tech, right? Impact funds, and then infrastructure funds who are looking to, deploy quite a bit of capital over a period of time with a big directional bet. And so is methane an issue? Are greenhouse gases an issue? Are they going to be an issue 5 years from now? 10? Yes, right. We're making a directional bet, and they're looking for innovative technologies or solutions to address that. So it's been a really broad spectrum. I think for us right now, we're looking at it and saying, okay, what's the next smart move for us in accomplishing what we need to accomplish over the next 3 to 5 years? And so the LPO has created a different dynamic than would have been the case otherwise, right? Because we have this enormous amount of low-cost leverage that we can apply. Now, we don't want to overextend ourselves on debt, but right now we're putting systems out driving really attractive MOICs, right? Multiples on invested capital, and great return.
MOICs, is that MOIC?
MOIC,
yeah.
MOIC.
Everyone's got their different ways of saying these things.
Yeah. So that alone attracts even equity investment, right? But when you can apply a little bit of leverage to it, the return profiles for the infrastructure investors are just incredibly attractive. So I think we're actually right in the midst right now of kind of sorting through, what do we think that right capital partner is? What's the right quantum to raise at this stage? What are some of the inflection points that we think we'll see? There is strategic interest, which, for our mission to flatten the methane curve, that may make sense at some point to say, is there a company that's got a global reach right now that could really take this far and wide quickly? So we're thinking through that, but it looks like we're going to have some great optionality, and we've got a really smart team. Brought in a great CFO who's local guy here. All of our founders are still involved with the business. That can be a rarity, and right. And so it's a real strength.
And I don't know the inner dynamic. You're the primary person I know there, but you, as CEO, certainly has a big influence over that. A CEO can, create an environment where people want to stick around and be part of it, but a CEO also can create an environment where
you're right.
People want to get out because they're not very happy. And so, my guess is you deserve a lot of, credit.
I was very,
for that.
Well, I appreciate that. I was very intentional, and we did spend quite a bit of time of thinking through what folks wanted. And again, when you make contact with the market, you find, maybe I'm not as interested in that piece. And so I think for the founding team continues to make incredible contributions, not just on the technical side, but on the commercial side. Mm-hmm. And so that's a balance. But I always thought, boy, you're doing it right if the people with the original vision and the passion can stay with the business. And so that was very intentional. And I think we're rewarded for it. My job, and I think this is true for anybody in a leadership position, is try to put everybody on the team in a position to be successful. and also be pretty direct when it comes to making hard decisions. And when people don't fit, you've got to make those changes. But the I would say it's one of really a core intangible value, hard to quantify, that the founding team is still so engaged and so passionate about what we're doing. And it's one of those things where I talk to our team about this. It's like there's honor in all work, but you're incredibly lucky if you have the chance to get involved with something that has an impact, right? And so we should all feel really grateful to be working, one, with just a very cool technology in a very cool industry in a great city, right? Great town. But to be actually able to say the stuff I do today is going to have a positive impact. And so I think that it becomes infectious within an organization. And so I give a lot of credit to the fact that we've been able to, retain some incredible talent, attract and retain incredible talent, including our founders, is because we have this really cool mission-driven purpose. And so I give some. While I can be intentional as the CEO about ensuring we've got a good culture and that we're creating the right environment for people to thrive, we also just have the benefit of the thing that we're doing is having a real positive impact, and it's a great thing for people to rally around. So for that, I'm just grateful, right?
And this is your first
start
and maybe last CEO gig,
maybe,
given how well it's likely to go, but this is your first time as being a CEO, right? So you're a new CEO?
No, I actually had 2 previous CEO roles.
Okay.
It's interesting. I thought, the path, and maybe you have a perspective on this, but the CEO position is probably the one position that has the least defined path, right? You be a CFO, there's kind of a defined path. You can come up through accounting, or you can be a doctor. There's a pretty defined path. The CEO role, you can come up through sales. You can come up.
That's absolutely true.
You can start a company, right?
Yeah.
But it doesn't have a systematic. Like you take these 10 steps, and you'll.
I haven't thought of it that way, but that's absolutely the case. As you were saying it, I'm thinking of CEOs, and every one of them that I know, that the first 10 names I came up with in my head had very different backgrounds from one another.
Yeah, and so I always kind of recognized that kind of early, because I always had an ambition, maybe not in a bad sense, but I felt like that's something I really wanted to do. And so what's interesting is just a little side story, but I was in telecom my whole career, right? So I was at NextLink, ADT Security Services, doing M&A, buying up small mom and pop security service providers and rolling them onto the ADT platform. And then went to NextLink, Nextel, right? They're sister companies, Macaw companies at the time, kind of leading right up to the meltdown of the telecom industry, late 90s, early 2000s. And what was now XO Communications, right, kind of rebranded, was moving everything back to Reston, Virginia. And so I was going to move there, but then I got this great offer from Quest. So I'm like, oh, this is brilliant, right? Quest Communications, this is after DREG, and had acquired US West. And I think it was my second week, Joe Nacho walked out of the building, and I'm like, what is going on here?
Do you know I'm publishing this book here?
No.
This is a advanced reader copy. What do you guys, or
This
maybe
one
if you
right
grab
here?
that one there, yeah. And so it's called Bandwidth.
Okay.
And it has all those stories in there. It has NextLink in there, XO.
Yeah.
It has Quest. The whole beginning of the internet through the rapid growth of the fiber networks in the 90s to the big boom in the late 90s, the bust that followed, and then the slow rise back to really present day.
Yeah.
So
I'm
that's
looking
part
forward
of
to reading that, because I lived a big chunk of that. So I had that experience at Quest, which was fascinating. And then I had an opportunity to join a private equity-backed telecom consultancy that was doing negotiating telecom contracts on behalf of global 500 companies. And that was an interesting experience. And then I came to Zayo. And I went to the E911 business. We ended up kind of selling that. And I was kind of figuring out, okay, what do I do next? And I got a call from a private equity firm, Altera Group, an energy VC private equity firm in Denver, this is random, Dan. So they said, hey, Ian, could you help us look at an investment in oil and gas, in energy? And I went down and sat down with them and I said, well, look, this was an advanced oil field equipment manufacturer. I said, all I know about oil and gas is filling my car up. And at the time, like manufacturing like Legos with my 4-year-old, they're like, no, we just need a good set of eyes and put a pro forma together. So what started as a 2-week, and I was fairly resistant to do it because I felt like I'm gonna let these guys down. And just a 2-week engagement turned into a 4-month get the deal closed. And this is back to this path to the CEO role.
This would have been roughly what year?
This is 2012.
Okay.
So I got involved with that work. I had something else I was doing. I just kept kind of putting that off, and it was that worked for me just to keep delaying it. Well, we got the deal closed, and Altura said, hey, would you mind taking the reins for 90 days while we do a search for a CEO? Somebody knows what the hell they're doing in this space. And in those 90 days, we took action on a bunch of stuff. We restructured the debt, formed a partnership with Caterpillar, and 4.5 years later, that was my first CEO role.
So were you CEO that
CEO.
4.5 years?
Yeah.
Wow.
And it was the other fascinating thing about it. So that was my path, right? It was me kind of taking a little bit of a risk, totally different industry, manufacturing, and saying, this is interesting in and of itself, and then take the reins for 90 days. I wasn't even contemplating that I would be the long-term CEO, but what we accomplished in that period of time led to that. And, I'd always worked in telecom in downtown Denver, the Denver Tech Center, office buildings, All of a sudden now I'm driving 80 miles to eastern Colorado to a dirt parking lot in a big steel building. And I met some of the most incredible people out there. And so it was formative for me. It was a great place for me to
How often were you making that drive?
How often? 4.5 years every day.
Every day.
80 miles each way. Is a meditation, right? I mean, it was really...
That was before you could put on a podcast.
That, I think I am one of the first podcast subscribers because they were just coming into...
Do you remember which ones you listened to when they first were coming out?
There was Joe Rogan was a pretty early one, so I listened to some of the early ones there. There was Sam Harris got a podcast going pretty early.
What effect do you think the podcast industry and Joe Rogan in particular had on this election?
I don't know, but I think there's no way to say they didn't. I'm a big fan of the long form conversation. I think it's just super valuable, but I think there's also a responsibility in those conversations to be asking the real questions and to, especially in consequential conversations, right? To, be asking some of those tougher questions. I mean, I don't know. I got to imagine it had some impact. The audience for like a Joe Rogan swamps CNN, Fox News, and all of them combined.
Yeah. They said the views on Joe Rogan's podcast with Donald Trump were several whole number multiples higher than the amount of people who watched the debate.
Yeah.
It was just
so
gigantic.
It's gigantic. And so with that comes...
And John F. Kennedy Jr., if it wasn't for podcasts, I'm not sure any of us would have come to realize that, he had something significant to say that we need to at least hear him out. It was the long form podcast that gave him that forum to do that, where you couldn't help but having listened to it say, okay, this guy's not a crackpot, and he doesn't just, believe these simplified versions of what people replay.
Yeah.
There's something to what he's saying that is really worth understanding and listening to. And, you think of that alone, him, leaving the Democratic Party, joining up with Trump. If it weren't for podcasts, hard to believe any of that could have possibly happened.
Yeah. There's no way it's having a huge impact on the information system for sure. And these long form conversations are hugely valuable because these little buzzwords these little clips and 30 seconds and rebuttals and stuff to actually have a long form discussion. And those conversations, in my view, can become incredibly consequential. And so I think, podcasts will continue to bring a lot of value, but I do think that, that it has impact. And so there's a real responsibility for some of these huge platforms.
Well, even this conversation here that we just had, those who are interested in quantum, either as an investor or as an entrepreneur looking for their next wave of where they should focus on, if they get to the point where they're hearing us talk right now, they're going to be really interested in quantum, and they're going to be very interested in Longpath. And it's a great way for people to talk in a way that will get a deeper message into the hands of people who have a narrowcast interest in it.
Well, that's why I was so, Dan, when you announced that you were launching this podcast, I was thrilled. One, for our community here in Boulder, but just more broadly. So I think, the opportunity to come join you here today and talk about Longpath and reconnect with you was fantastic. But I think this is really important for the business community, for Colorado, and you've had great guests on. I'm now got you at the top of my subscription. I've been listening.
You're the third quantum one in the first couple 3 months that we're doing this, and it's not all just scale tech companies. We've got one that's dropping really soon. I don't know the sequence. It's probably going to drop before listening to this, but it's a different type of community leader, someone who's doing stuff that is, means a lot to so many of us, and a very fascinating individual. And but it has nothing to do with tech scale up leadership. So that's had some Mayor Johnson, great one with him, Attorney General Phil Weiser. So a lot of really interesting range of guests. So part of our mission and purpose at what we do at Crucial Ventures is to really give back to the Colorado community in a way that supports kind of the leaders of the community who are doing good on behalf of others. That's kind of where our mission is. So I'm at a spot in my life where I could invest in something like podcasts, invest in a very qualified team like the people in front of us here to help us produce these, and not worry about it being a moneymaker for us personally, but it should be a value creator for the Colorado community and beyond, and that's really what's driving this.
Well, it's fantastic, and you've had huge impact on this business community through Zayo and the other stuff that you've done, but this is big impact too, right? And like you said, it's not about the monetary side, but it'll have a big impact. So I've just, from one friend to another, thanks for doing it.
Appreciate it. So anything we haven't talked about that you want to hit up here?
This has been great. I think I just want to welcome anybody who is interested in learning more about Longpath to dive in, and I would just encourage people to really, if you're interested, and whether you're young or even a little further on your career, to explore, because the quantum industry and these companies that are doing this innovative work, it's not just PhDs. It's not just scientists, right? There's all kinds of interesting work to do in this space.
Well, let's put that into perspective. You said you have today 50 employees. How many of those 50 are scientists and physicists?
Yeah, I would say 7. That's just a number.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, it's a small percentage.
Right? And then how many others are engineers? Like engineers
we've got
with engineering
10
degrees?
engineers, software, hardware engineers. Yeah. So we would have everything that you would have in a construct of a business. We have our accounting and finance staff. We have our HR. We've got folks that are deploying these systems in the field. We got people that are assembling them. We've got sales and marketing.
So some people are deploying and assembling. What would their backgrounds look like?
We just need somebody who's good mechanically, right? And so we don't even need a degree necessarily. We've got a couple folks who are just, just very skilled at being able to put together, fine pieces of equipment with great leadership and great design. But the bulk of our employee base as we grow won't require those advanced degrees. And we'll always have a core tech capability in our PhDs and our scientists, and we got atmospheric scientists and the engineers, software and hardware. But in any organization, what you end up growing is a lot of that other support, administrative and otherwise.
Yeah, that's one of the themes.
So I think the percentage of those advanced degree PhDs will become a lower percentage for us as we grow. It won't even keep that same percentage.
And even if you did keep the same percentage, the super majority of your base already today is not people with advanced engineering and science degrees. And that's part of the theme of Elevate Quantum is workforce development and creating and sustaining high-paying jobs with the recognition that the super majority of those jobs aren't, high-end scientists, advanced degrees.
The great
super
jobs,
majority include technicians, include the full array of work that it takes to scale up businesses, salespeople, accountants,
supply chain management.
So getting out in front of this quantum revolution is going to be the gift that keeps on giving for those communities who are strong in quantum, and that's why Colorado wants to be one of the leaders.
Yep.
And getting that word out, getting that broader exposure to the Colorado community, so that we see the fullness of this opportunity has been part of what we've been doing.
I'm glad we hit on that, because it's a really important part of supporting this ecosystem we're building. Is we need bright, talented people. You don't need the PhD, right? We just need bright people in their disciplines.
Great.
And so that's another exciting part for sure.
All right. Well, thank you so
Dan,
much
thank
for
you.
being a guest.
Yeah,
I can't wait till we drop this one. It's gonna be a lot of people who are very interested in learning more about quantum. And I think a lot of those people will be like, how do I get on board with Longpath? Because Longpath, and as I said, I do have a friend who was part of our bandwidth journey, who is in a very significant role in Saudi Arabia. So I look forward to introducing you there as well, and finding other ways to help you guys in your journey.
Onward, upward. Thank you.
All right.
Thanks, Dan.
Thank you for listening to this episode of The Bear Roars featuring Ian Dickinson. This podcast was produced by Loud Bear Productions and edited by Courtney Caruso with support from Kendall Weinberg, Emily Reed, and Gibson Siegert.